Hello, everyone, and thank you, organizers, for this opportunity. I am Sindhuja Bhakthavatsalam from California State University, Northridge. And the title of my talk today is A Virtue Epistemological Rejection of the Value-Free Ideal. This is still a bit of a nascent work, so bear with me. The case for the claim that scientific inquiry is or should be value-laden with values here referring to the so-called non-epistemic values, that is typically social or ethical values, is often made through appeal to the view that scientists have social or moral responsibilities that they cannot ignore or eschew. So in this talk, I argue that in many cases, non-epistemic values are indispensable in scientific inquiry since the stakes are primarily epistemic and not just social. Non-epistemic values often need to be considered toward epistemic ends. Hence, to not take them into account in scientific inquiry amounts to being epistemically irresponsible and insensitive to the epistemic and, of course, moral goals of others. While a prominent refrain in the literature is to highlight the moral consequences or stakes of scientists considering or not considering non-epistemic values in their work, here I want to highlight epistemic consequences. The argument in a nutshell is that scientific knowledge is largely produced in social contexts for specific purposes, and that the production of scientific knowledge needed in such contexts inevitably needs to involve non-epistemic values. And insofar as it is within the purview of scientific work to provide domain-specific knowledge, it is arguably a core epistemic responsibility of scientists to do so, and hence to take into account non-epistemic values. Now, much has been discussed about the taxonomy of values in science in the literature, and it is beyond the scope of this talk to cover all of that. But I'd like to highlight just one relevant distinction or division in the kind of values that enter science. Harmful biases of scientists leading to detrimental values such as racist and sexist values, and values that are beneficial or essential to doing science or perceived to be so. So here I focus on the latter and not so much on the former. So let's look at a couple of examples of non-epistemic values at work in science from the literature. So there's this example of wetland banking given by Kevin Elliott. Kevin Elliott and Daniel McCoggan. I'm just going to read parts or excerpts from that example from the paper. Over the course of the 20th century, scientists began to recognize that wetlands performed a host of valuable functions, including water purification, storm protection, nutrient cycling, and animal habitat. In recent years, regulatory agencies have been allowing developers to purchase mitigation credits from specialists who create banks of preserved or restored wetlands. And then they go on to say, science becomes important to this mitigation banking process because regulators have to decide whether restored wetlands are sufficiently similar to the destroyed wetlands in order to justify trading the two. And then they say, bankers need assessments to be authoritative, cheap, and quick. So in other words, in order to develop a flourishing mitigation banking system, these non-epistemic values must sometimes be prioritized over epistemic values like predictive accuracy when choosing assessment models. For example, because plants are relatively easy to look at, and because botanists have developed some relatively high quality analyses of the plants in various sorts of wetlands, the function of quote unquote floristic biodiversity has become a rough indicator for most other wetland functions. And then they note that regulatory guidelines require that the identification of plant species be performed in May or June when most plants have not yet flowered. Therefore, the assessors have to base their assessments on the observation of plant features that may indicate the identity of particular species but that are not compelling by rigorous botanical standards. So that was one example. In cases where scientific knowledge production has very little to do with the real world, so to speak, or at least apparently so, my argument might not be as applicable, but as scholars have shown, even quote unquote pure science research is almost never completely devoid of non-epistemic values. So as Kent Staley shows through a case study of the discovery of the Higgs boson, the setting of the 5 sigma standard for the level of significance for results involved, for the significance of results involved considerations of impact on future physics inquiries, as well as broader goals of the relevant research groups, including the ATLAS and CMS groups, as well as the high energy physics community and scientists more broadly. So here's a quote from the article. The much anticipated discovery claims were articulated not only in detailed scientific talks aimed at the physics community, but also in a presentation to the media that was broadcast via the internet worldwide and featured prominently among the news of the day. To get things wrong would have been tremendously embarrassing. A comprehensive assessment of all risks of such an error would include a political dimension with potentially negative consequences for the funding of high energy physics, end quote. Now, one might argue that the scientific products in question here don't really count as epistemic, since they don't prioritize accuracy or truthfulness. But that way, it has been hotly debated whether even many of the values often categorized as epistemic, such as empirical adequacy, internal consistency, and explanatory power, are indeed epistemic. Leading Larry Loudon to use the term cognitive values rather than epistemic. And B, we don't have to really get saddled with epistemological debates here about what constitutes knowledge, strictly speaking, and whether knowledge requires truth and so on. We can go with the commonly understood meaning of the phrase scientific knowledge. And if we go down that rabbit hole, we'd have to exclude much of what most of us consider to be scientific knowledge. Or I'm happy to go with the term cognitive in both cases. If we really want to be strict about reserving the term epistemic for only truth-related matters or concerns. But the point is that we're talking about goods that aren't immediately moral or social. Now, one might argue that the ultimate goal in these cases is practical or social and not scientific per se, or that the ultimate goods are moral and not epistemic. In other words, these all have to do with concerns external to the core of science. For instance, banking or communicating scientific results or what have you. However, we can distinguish here between proximal and distal consequences. It might be true that the distal consequences are practical or social in nature. I think, in fact, it is true. But the fact remains that the proximal consequence is knowledge production. So essentially, we are talking about epistemic ends in the service of social ends, but it's worth underlining the epistemic. It doesn't make sense to say that only knowledge for its own sake, whatever that is, counts as an epistemic good. Much of this argument hangs on what kind of knowledge the relevant scientists provide. For instance, in the wetland banking case, if a scientist argued that they'd like to prioritize the value of accuracy at the cost of other values like speed, they'd ultimately still be providing knowledge, of course, but not the right kind, not the kind that's required in the given social spatiotemporal context. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about virtue epistemology, in particular, the idea of other regarding epistemic virtues championed by Jason Kowal. So in an important contribution to virtue epistemology, Kowal notes that traditionally, both analytic and virtue epistemology have always, quote unquote, quietly assumed epistemic individualism. The focus has always been on the individual epistemic agent, her beliefs, her justifications, and so on. Kowal notes that in contrast, ethics has always focused both on the individual as well as our duties toward and concerns with others. But think about the three major schools of ethics: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. Even though virtue ethics talks about things like individual flourishing, eudaimonia, or what have you, many commonly cited virtues such as kindness and benevolence are meant to be directed at others. Epistemic individualism then seems to be the epistemic equivalent of ethical egoism, as Kowal notes. So Kowal argues that we should focus on developing and maintaining epistemic virtues directed at others, such as honesty, patience, and epistemic benevolence. And he says, we can understand such traits to be epistemic virtues insofar as they tend to produce knowledge, not for the agent alone, but for her community, end quote. So I would like to adapt Kowal's view here and argue that scientists would be epistemically virtuous, in particular displaying other regarding virtues, in engaging with non-epistemic values that serve to produce knowledge for a given community. So when we talk about epistemic responsibility, the idea of epistemic responsibility, once again, the concept in the epistemology literature has only focused on the individual. The general idea being that epistemic responsibility involves a responsibility of an individual to form well-founded beliefs. Kowal doesn't really talk about responsibility as a virtue, but I want to invoke this idea here. Extending Kowal's general argument, I think we can meaningfully talk about having responsibility toward contributing to others' epistemic benefits being an important other regarding epistemic virtue. So I now want to present an argument. Premise 1, if it is in your power to generate and provide required knowledge in a certain social, spatiotemporal context, and we might add something like without any significant costs to yourself, then having the virtue of epistemic responsibility toward others, be it members of your immediate scientific community, policymakers, or the public at large, asks that you generate and provide that knowledge. Insofar as scientists are epistemic agents of significance to society, they should have epistemic responsibility toward others. As in the above examples, it is in the power of the relevant scientists to generate and provide required knowledge in the respective contexts. Therefore, it was their responsibility to generate and provide that required knowledge. Now, premise 2 is probably the most contentious link, and it remains to be argued for properly. One might counter this premise by arguing that the reason I say scientists should have epistemic responsibility toward others is ultimately because that leads to the greater good, ethically speaking. And if that's true, then my bid to present an argument on almost purely epistemic grounds doesn't succeed. Now, I'm inclined to think the premise is true regardless of the resultant social goods and solely on virtue epistemological grounds, but this probably does need further explication. Briefly, deciding what the knowledge is required for, or the constraint setting part of it, does involve directly considering ethical consequences. But once that is decided at each step of the scientific process, the process of generating and producing knowledge to meet those requirements or constraints seems to me to be a more purely epistemic process. Now, the argument from inductive risk that goes back to Richard Rudner and revived by Heather Douglas goes that scientists routinely make value judgments in accepting or rejecting hypotheses, since the acceptance or rejection depends on the social or ethical costs of making a mistake. Although more general, my argument is especially relevant to responding to counter arguments to Rudner from the likes of Richard Jeffrey and Isaac Levi, that scientists should only stick to the canons of inference, quote unquote. Many have argued along these lines that it is the job of those who use or apply the science to engage in the value-laden process of accepting or rejecting hypotheses. For instance, Joyce Hafstad and Matthew Brown call this the deferred decision response. Existing replies to this line of argument include that there are too many decision points throughout the scientific process to involve non-scientists, and importantly, that only scientists have the technical expertise to make value judgments through this process. So my argument sits comfortably with these responses. And I think it goes a step further in saying that it is actually the responsibility, the epistemic responsibility of scientists to make these decisions. What do we gain from this approach? Firstly, I think this approach or this argument draws attention to and makes explicit the epistemic ends of invoking non-epistemic values in many contexts. And it probably will get less resistance from the epistemic purity of science folks, folks who argue that only internal or purely epistemic values should play a role in the core of science. Since this argument shows that in several of the cases where non-epistemic values are at play in scientific inquiry, scientists are still playing the knowledge game, even if ultimately that knowledge is in the service of social goods. This approach makes the move, at least in some contexts, from considering non-epistemic values as part of scientists' general responsibilities to their role responsibilities. It is still, of course, true that scientists have a general responsibility to not cause harm to society, either through recklessness or negligence in their work, as discussed by Heather Douglas. But the approach presented here hints at considering essential or beneficial non-epistemic values or non-epistemic values perceived to be beneficial in their work as being part of the role responsibility, not just general responsibility. This is, of course, very much in line with Rudner's claim. After all, the title of his paper is "The Scientist qua Scientist Makes Value Judgments." But while Rudner notes that even if the scientist only assigns probabilities to hypotheses without accepting or rejecting them, that still involve value judgments, he doesn't quite spell out why scientists should accept or reject hypotheses. Lastly, I think a virtue epistemological approach always helps with respect to making us, here scientists in particular, reflect and better ourselves as epistemic agents. Virtue epistemology, importantly, has ameliorative value. It is, in Qasim Qasam's words, a kind of regulative epistemology that can help us become better epistemic agents. For instance, it would certainly help for a scientist to reflect on their work and consider whether unquestioningly prioritizing epistemic values is really epistemically virtuous. What purpose is the fixation on epistemic values serving? Personal ego? A blind adherence to some sort of pie-in-the-sky scientific standards? Epistemic humility or a sense of responsibility would help the scientist see value in producing the kind of knowledge required for social goods. What I've proposed here, certainly isn't a new idea, but more of a shift in focus. It is in a sense obvious that scientists in any capacity produce epistemic goods. But what I've done here is put the focus on that in the context of the debate on non-epistemic values in science in order to drive home the point via a quick tour into virtue epistemology that it is epistemically virtuous for scientists to actively consider non-epistemic values in their work when doing so produces domain-specific knowledge required in a certain practical context. And arguably, it is epistemically vicious to not do this. There are other strands to this project that I haven't touched on. For instance, how developing self-regarding virtues such as reflectiveness can help alleviate wishful thinking when employing values in science. And having other regarding epistemic virtues asks that scientists be transparent about the values that play a role in their work. With a detailed discussion of those would be for another day. Some directions for future research here include, making more robust connections to epistemology, in particular, social epistemology, practical rationality, pragmatist epistemology, and epistemic contextualism. In particular, when we talk about the role that non-epistemic values play in choice of research projects, that lines up nicely with Alvin Goldman's view that, Alvin Goldman has argued in Knowledge in a Social World that ultimately epistemic value is accuracy with respect to questions of interest and not mere accuracy alone. I mean, for our purposes, we can focus on the interest part of this view rather than the accuracy part. We could replace accuracy with something like fitness, but it's interesting that there is kind of a parallel in the epistemology literature. Anyway, so that's it for now. Thank you.